Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of UL Week 2020, Bits of Public Space. And we still don't have a lot of many attendances, so I think we can come back in 10 minutes. So grab a cup of coffee, prepare for intensive day and very attractive morning. So first we will have a lecture of Thijs Turel and Surbi Agrawal. Take yourself comfortable, take a coffee, and meet you at 9:10, back in the same room.
So did you guys have a good day yesterday?
Hi, Surbi.
Hi.
Yeah, that was a good day for lectures.
No, I'm not able.
And how is it at the faculty now?
Sorry?
How is it at the faculty? Is it quite empty?
Yeah, it's empty. We just have like 1 day per week in faculty.
Yeah.
That we can use. Yeah, but that's very good. Yeah. In that kind of situations.
Oh. Right.
Good morning, everyone. So welcome back to UL Week, second day, once again. So we might start now. And yeah, it's going to be a very exciting day with one lecture of Thijs Turel and Surbi Akval. And then we will have workshop by Block 74. Then we will have, the workshop will be for those who attended and who subscribed for workshop before, and it will happen at 10:40. And you already got the different link. So it's for those who will attend workshop. Then we will have lunch break, and after lunch break, we have another session, the general session of Pecha Kucha, where everyone can attend. It will start at 13 in Central European time, 13 o'clock. We will have 4 speakers, and then we will continue workshop at the end. So it's going to be intensive day. But first we start with the lecture, and I will ask Maurice to introduce the topic of the session of the morning. So Maurice, I give a word for you. So please join.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucas. For the audience, yesterday you were able to understand the emergence of virtual space and question first how it's currently intertwining with the physical space. Today, you will connect this new understanding to the practice of our professions, the professions of urban designers, urban thinkers, landscape architects, and so on. Thus, today you will ask yourself how to do this. So, welcome also on my behalf to this second day of Bits of Public Space 3.0. And in a kind of summary of yesterday, or at least taking some sound bites from there, I would like to introduce and build a bridge to today's lecture. How to do this? Well, perhaps if we understand more today's high-frequency models and combine them with our low-frequency models as in accordance to Michael Betti, and merge them if possible, or at least accept that they both exist. Which could mean that we have to study people's behavior real-time and online, and combine it with the physical public space as it is in the long durée. Therefore, we may use the clouds and converge the digital, as said by Carlo Ratti, with the physical. What do people do and where? Our mobility patterns seem to change. More and more we stay close to the house, especially today, of course, but the situation is unique, as said by Hendrik Thiebe, and enjoy the public space which is in the vicinity of our houses. Homes become workplaces, shops, as we shop online, leisure places, etc. But will we follow the strategy of Twitter, as questioned by Ratti again? Will we indeed stay fully at home, work dedicated from our houses? No, Thiebe would say. Ultimately, we as a community make public space. And the people make this space their place. Real humans are behind the wheel, Betti emphasized, as is real humans are behind the wheel in the virtual. So, to start the philosophical question of Robin of yesterday, where we ended, what side are you on? If it is not linearly related, what will you design? When everything merges into one non-linear reality. And maybe also the question is important, what do you not design? So how do you use your ethical cursor to design public spaces and keep everybody together, inclusive, yet also give everybody a place? At Delft University of Technology, we have several institutes which are concerned with such questions. We have the Delft Design for Values Institute, emphasizing all the ethical questions which are helping us to design for moral and social values. We have the Delta's Infrastructures and Mobility Initiative, engage with the mobility transition and thus including walkability, pedestrianization close to our house in order to appropriate these spaces. We have the Rotterdam Convergence Institute and we have the AMS Institute in Amsterdam. And we're very happy to have Thijs here. But before giving the word to Thijs, Lucas, could you say exactly who's listed to give the presentation?
Thank you, Maurice, for a very broad and nice, clear explanation on a very interesting topic that we have already for the second day. And yeah, I'm excited about having this lecture now. We will have 2 speakers in one lecture, so it's even more intense and even more interesting. We have Thijs Toerel and Surbi Akrawal. They are both from AMS from Amsterdam. It's Advanced Metropolitan Solutions Institute. And they are both members of Responsible Sensing Lab in that institute. Thijs is a program manager of the Urban Data and Intelligence Program. And he works on developing projects that use urban big data and intelligence to improve urban life, strengthen democratic processes and values in the cities. Surbi is an urbanist and architect by education, and she's passionate about shaping the urban experiences and enhancing the interaction of people within the city. So I now give a word for you, Thijs and Surbi. I don't know who will start, but yeah, you have time now. And I want to mention also for all listeners before you enter the floor that please use Q&A box. So after the lecture, we want to have very interactive, interesting talk. So ask questions that Thijs and Surbi will try to answer. Also, maybe you have something to add from your perspective. It's also interesting to see it. So yeah, use Q&A box and let's listen for lecture now. So Thijs and Surbi, I give you a word. You can enter.
Thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you, Maurice, for the introduction, and also thank you for having us here. I'm going to share my slide now. Yeah, can you all see my slides?
Yeah, of course, it's all good.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm from AMS Institute. We're working on this initiative called the Responsible Sensing Lab. Today we will be telling you something about our experiences there the last year. And this Responsible Sensing Lab, I will tell you more about it, but in a nutshell, it's about operationalizing human values in smart city systems, basically. That's what we're trying to do very closely together with the municipality of Amsterdam. So let's get started. So the first thing, and I think that has also been discussed yesterday, is that we are moving towards a smart and sensing city. And I have a background in infrastructure. I worked for an electricity grid infrastructure. So you see this thing happening there, that we used to have an electricity grid that has been around for 150 years or something like that. But now over the last 10 years, it's rapidly changing because of the introduction of digital technology. And you see the same thing happening in the road system. You see the same thing happening in the telecommunication system, in the water system, all these kind of subsystems that together make up the infrastructure for the city. And generally, this is kind of being done by a tech push. And generally, kind of the reason for introducing digital technology lies in improving efficiency. So for instance, in the electricity grid, there's a lot to do about so-called predictive maintenance. So if you know beforehand where electricity cables will fail, then that will make it greatly cheaper to prevent that failing and then rather replace them at first. But you also see efficiency in the terms of smart grids and smart traffic management. So there, the idea would be to prevent congestion and to prevent clog-ups of these urban infrastructures. Could be electricity, but could also be mobility related. And that also makes that we actually would get kind of more value from the infrastructures that we have, because more people can use them and we can use the limited capacity kind of broader. And kind of we get a wealth of data because we put sensors everywhere. The cost of putting sensors in places has greatly dropped. We collect a wealth of data to solve all these kinds of various problems. And just as a kind of illustration of that, the movie that you just saw playing here in the background, that is one day of the approximately 1,000 maintenance vehicles owned by the city of Amsterdam, which go and do their chores basically in the city. You see the movie ends at 11 o'clock in the morning. And by that time, you see kind of the road pattern of Amsterdam appearing. And this is just kind of the GPS trace data that you see. So there's a lot of data even on that. So that's one thing. On the other thing, there's also kind of increasing worry about the use of digital technology in urban space. Just to give you some examples, and now maybe let's start with, I think this discussion is even more familiar when you're talking about kind of non-urban space. So think about Twitter, Facebook, Google, and the power that these big tech companies have in basically, kind of influencing society in various ways. But that also kind of happens increasingly more in the urban space. And to give you some example, so on the left-hand side, there was this, as you may know, that facial recognition in the Netherlands is kind of a highly controversial technology to be using. And right now we are still in the stages of discussing whether there are even any circumstances under which we could use this technology because it's deemed so privacy invasive. On the other end, in China, apparently there's already an application for facial recognition to stop people in a public park stealing toilet paper, which I think from a Western perspective is kind of a not very proportional answer to a rather modest problem. Let's put it like that. Then there are also the other worries. This image you see on the slide on the right-hand side, that's an image that's an artist impression from the K-Site project that was going on for the last couple of years in Toronto. And the interesting thing about that is that it was actually being undertaken by a subsidiary of Alphabet, which is the mother company of Google. And there was a lot of tension there about the question, should you even allow kind of a commercial entity like that to develop an urban area? We had beautiful plans about that to basically measure everything and to use all the data that comes in to optimize basically the use of the city. But the project was discontinued some time back. And that is largely because a lot of local activists simply didn't like this way of operating the city. And then a third example to kind of also remind you that was the so-called Greyball scandal. It's hard these days, I think, to imagine what a revolution Uber was when we kind of first got to know it a couple of years back. But Uber has always kind of tried to be at the edge of things. Also, and one of the instances there was the introduction of the Greyball program. And that program was basically meant to deceive authorities which were checking on whether Uber was basically playing by the local taxi rules. So what they did was they made an alternative version of the Uber app, which they then presented to government officials. And this alternative version of the app, for some reason, you never could get it right. Sometimes it was failing, there was a server error, simply that there were no rights in existence. But by that means, they basically made it impossible for both critical journalists as well as government officials to basically prevent oversight authorities of actually doing their job. So these are just some illustrations of kind of the things that kind of get people worrying about digital technology. And in the Amsterdam region, people are particularly concerned with that. Because of that, a couple of years back, approximately 60 organizations from the Amsterdam region came together and they formed the so-called TADA Manifesto. The TADA Manifesto basically starts from the idea that we do not like the particular direction digital technology in our cities could be taking. So let's come up with some principles or some values even that we all agree with and start to incorporate these in the technology development of the city. And there are many manifestos like this around. But the interesting thing about the TADA Manifesto is that it's has been incorporated in the coalition agreement of the city of Amsterdam. So that means that the mayor and the deputy mayors actually have made it their job to, as they say, implement these TADA values. More on that later. So when you look at the question, how can you then do that? How can you make kind of the digital city more responsible? Not having market parties have too big a say in that, not having authorities that will in the future resemble kind of these big brother-like kind of authorities. What could you do? There are many approaches here, and in the Responsible Sensing Lab, we focus on one. So, but to quickly go through them, there's the legal approach. That's kind of, well, think about the GDPR, for instance, as a legal tool to simply make it, to prevent bad things or things that you do not want with personal data to happen. There's a lot of attention being paid to auditing. I mean, you can have all the right laws that you would want, but if nobody abides by the rules, then there's very little use. So right now there's a lot of thinking and projects going on about, for instance, the auditing of algorithms that take decisions in the city. There's a lot of attention also for the procurement process. I believe the combined spending power of all the Dutch local governments together is, I think, in the hundreds of millions or maybe even billions of euros. And if you kind of use all that spending power to come up with extra kind of conditions or requirements for the digital tools and services you buy, you might use that power to kind of leverage that for the better, basically. Insourcing is another thing that we see in Amsterdam. So that basically means, as a government, we say, for some vital technologies, we no longer want to be dependent on the market, what the market has to offer, but we're simply going to be building that ourselves. And Amsterdam has recently launched their own artificial intelligence team, which actually does coding and developing. And the obvious advantage of this is that you have complete control over the code you use and you run. And that's all things we're not doing in the Responsible Sensing Lab. We are focusing on design. Let me tell you more about that. So the challenge very basically is this. On the one hand, we want efficiency. And we want digital tools that bring us safety and efficiency. We don't want to pay too much taxes kind of for these things. And it's great that digital tools can bring us this. On the other end, we also have all these values, of which the TADA Manifesto is one example. But things such as autonomy, transparency, human control, privacy, etc. And in Amsterdam, we want these things even so strongly that these have been kind of written down in official policy documents. The key thing here is there's a tension between these two things, because the most efficient traffic routing system is not per se the traffic routing system that allows you the most freedom as an individual. And the system that's best designed to kind of keep the streets safe and secure is not particularly the system that would respect your privacy most. And then the question about responsible design is maybe, could we balance these two aspects? So the safety, the more business logic, but also kind of things we want as a society and as a public. When you look at sensors in the city, what you see is something like this. And you see sensors and kind of also smart objects that actually, I would say, maybe haven't been designed. I mean, they have maybe been designed to keep the rain out, or to make sure that all the components that are in them don't kind of fall. But there's very little attention being paid to how humans could actually interact with these sensors, how they could do something with that. The top right image is maybe an exception. I'm sure you've all seen these at least people from the Netherlands on the railway stations in the Netherlands. There was some decision about how we could design these cameras to make them maybe seem more friendly to humans. But for the rest, there's very little attention to actually engaging with citizens or local people in this whole physical part of the smart city. And why is it interesting to focus on the physical design of these things? We think for two things. Although we probably all spend too much time on our phones and doing these things, we still live in the physical reality. And the physical space is also where we ought to be able to interact with the digital part of the city. So the idea of introducing touch points, kind of the effects where you can interact with the kind of the whole part of the system that's digital and hidden to you, but that should be easy and intuitive, and it should be not a burden. And that means for us that you have to think about how these things look like in public space and what you can do with them. And the second thing is kind of rather an other argument. The great thing we all say about software is that you can update it overnight. But that itself brings a lot of risks, because that also means that people can hack into your system and they can change it for the worse. Or maybe in sometimes even the people who ought to have control over the system can also integrate new features into it, which you as a user do not particularly like. And the interesting thing about also thinking about physical interventions is that they are more permanent. So we should think very carefully about which part of this smart city are we going to be designing in the physical realm, and which part do we think could we do in the virtual realm. And with this Responsible Sensing Lab, I think we're making the argument that we should spend more time on thinking about the physical part of this. And we will give you some examples on that. So then the question is, how do we design responsible sensing systems? And before I presented you these two circles, and I presented this as kind of a tension that ought to be overcome. But the idea about value sensitive design, which is the approach we're using, is that if you redesign the system, you could maybe design it in such a way that the tension doesn't even occur. And that's kind of the approach that we're trying to use in our Responsible Sensing Lab. So to show you, make it a little bit more concrete. Here, what does it actually look like? So here in the middle, you have a typical Amsterdam person, represented as a mom with a cargo bike and 2 kids. And what does she see from this whole smart city rhetoric, I think, that's going on? She actually sees 2 things, or she could see 2 things. There could be sensors, such as cameras, but there also could be actuators, such as traffic lights, things that do something in the physical space, things that make things possible for you, but things that do not also make things impossible for you. But behind this whole thing, there's kind of another layer, and that's a layer of the digital. So typically in these devices, there's a lot of onboard processing going on. That's kind of what the algorithm is doing on the device. And then typically kind of a sensor would send its observations towards some server somewhere. There would be some processing on the data. There would also be dashboard controls that would allow some part of the city authorities to see how that particular system of the city is doing and whether it would need management attention. But increasingly, we are starting to automate this. So that would mean that the processing doesn't just kind of yield results for human operators, but it would also send instructions back to the devices on the street. Well, traffic lights, as you may know, have been doing this for decades on end, but we're starting to use that approach in more and more systems, such as the electricity grid and the whole idea of smart charging there, which I will be presenting on a little bit later. So if you see this kind of coming from a technical kind of as what's happening in a smart city, we concern ourselves with these kind of questions. So what type of sensor technology are we choosing exactly? Because that matters a great deal when you think about how it can impact the user. Particular sensors can measure particular things, but they also cannot measure particular things. And that's interesting. Where do you put the intelligence? So where's all the processing going on? Where from an IT developer perspective, there could be kind of an interest to have this all happen in the cloud, in some server somewhere, because there you have huge processing power and you can basically do anything you want with that. But increasingly, there's also attention for putting things on the device, actually make all the things happening at the sensor themselves. And that is for programming reasons, but also because it makes things a little bit more privacy secure. We will go into that later. Something that's really overlooked, if you remember my example from, I think, 2 sheets back, what sensors look like in the city nowadays and these smart objects. So how do they look? Where are they placed even? Are they placed high or are they placed lower? What do they explain about themselves? At present, they explain very little. They're just boxes. You can't tell what's in there from the outside. You can't even, in most cases, tell which party is kind of operating them. And that brings us to the higher level kind of questions. So how can you interact with these sensors? What does it even mean to be interacting? Because right now they're just kind of, well, let's say most sensors in the city right now, you could see them as the eyes and the ears of the mayor of a city, basically. They're meant there to kind of get this information. How can you know you can trust these sensors? And how can you contest them? What if you disagree, if you don't like the sensor, if you don't like what it's going to be doing to you or your feel for of that? How can you do that? And that's kind of the stuff we are thinking about in the Responsible Sensing Lab. So moving on from there. One of the things we're also trying to do, I presented you these TADA values. And the great thing about these values, TADA, but there have also been values mentioned by the Rathenau Institute, which is advising the Dutch Parliament on kind of these type of issues. They say things about human dignity and other values. The great thing about these values is that they're kind of, in one way, kind of a point on the horizon. They say we should spend more attention on this, and we should be working towards that. But then the problem is, what does that actually even mean? And what we're trying to do in our Responsible Sensing Lab is to simply try that out. There are a lot of different operationalizations possible for all these values, really a lot, but we have to try, and we also have to spend part of the innovation budget we have as public authorities, not just on the question, how can we use digital technology to make stuff even more cheap and kind of run more smoothly? But we also should be spending some money on the question, how could we maybe bolster autonomy? Or how could we make sure that human dignity is being preserved in this increasingly digital future? And that's what we're trying to find out. And that's really an exploration, kind of a journey we're on right now. So what Surbi and me did is, for this presentation, we basically gathered our thoughts from the last, I think, 10 months we've been working on this, and we formed them in a kind of hypothesis. So that it basically is, that is our current best understanding on what responsible sensing actually would mean when you apply it to these kind of sensing systems and also their physical materiality, but also the software behind that in a city. And the thing about hypotheses is that you ought to test them to see whether they, they're valid or they're not, they're invalid, really. And basically for us, the testing of our hypotheses means testing, I think, on two kinds of scales. So the first scale would be, does the sensing system kind of deliver for the city authorities that need it? Because if it doesn't do its job, then why bother have it? But the second thing is, does it also in some way kind of make people feel better about the digital city we are living in? Well, the understandability is one of the hypotheses, contestability, human dignity, sensor minimization, self-regulation, and accessibility. These are kind of aspects that we think could be materialized in the physical-digital realm of the smart city. And the rest of the talk will really just be Surbi and me taking you through these hypotheses, explaining you a little bit what we mean by them, yeah, that's kind of what we will be doing. So I'll just simply be starting with the first. So understandability. So the idea about understandability, or the hypothesis for understandability, is basically that sensing systems should be understandable to citizens. And they shouldn't just be understandable. We think there are two levels that matter: the superficial level and the procedural level, the more in-depth level. Let me take you through that. First, go to the problem of understandability. On the left-hand side, you see an example that you may have seen in the press. And this was an algorithm that's being used, I think, still in the United States to help judges in giving a sentence on somebody who's going to be convicted. And the system basically looks at the characteristics of somebody who's in front of the judge, and then it would give advice trying to optimize basically the risk of recidive, so the risk that they'll do it again, but also try to limit the time they ought to spend in prison or something like that, because prison also costs money. But the thing about this is that this was kind of a black box algorithm, and civil rights activists quickly found that it was for people of color. They typically got a way higher risk assessment than people who were white, but the exact kind of same in the same situation. But they couldn't do very much about that because the algorithm was very kind of closed. Now, these things also start happening in the city, and I will take you through that by using the example of smart charging. First we think electric vehicles will become the standard. So right now they're this niche phenomenon, but in the future we will all become more reliant on electric vehicles. The thing is, if you look at the way the Dutch electricity grid has been built over the decades, it's simply impossible to be charging all these cars at the same time. A car has a huge energy consumption. You simply can't charge them all at the same time, because then just what's happening in your own home, if you try to turn on the dishwasher and the vacuum cleaner and all the other appliances at the same time, a fuse will blow. And that the same thing will happen in the electricity grid. So either then you basically spend billions or millions or maybe even $1 billion of euros trying to increase the power grid, or you simply stop charging all the cars at the same time. And if you don't charge them all at the same time, that means that you need to divide and prioritize. You have to decide which car is going to be charged first. And as it happens, digital tools are an excellent means to do that. And that is called smart charging. So a smart charging algorithm typically is a device that's in a charging station. So that's kind of the thing you see on the street that you can use to charge your electric vehicle. But it's connected to a computer somewhere in the cloud that basically says to the car, now you can charge, now you can't, now you can charge, now you can't. That's what it's doing. And once you have that system, you can basically say, first this car charges, and then that car charges, and then the other car charges. And in that way, you can prevent the electricity grid from being overburdened. But the point is, what you see, once you have this system in place, it becomes really cheap and easy to add additional lines of code to that. So other input requirements. So just to mention a few here, you cannot just think about the electricity grid, but you could also introduce the to incorporate the price of electricity in the charging behavior. You could see about local solar energy production and try to also integrate that. So typically charge cars whenever there's kind of a surplus of solar energy. You could take into consideration how full the battery of the car is. You could take into consideration when a user needs to leave. So it would make sense to spend a little bit more capacity on charging a user that has to leave in an hour than a user that has to leave in 12 hours, something like that. And what we see right now, we are moving towards a system where all these factors are being integrated into one big smart charging algorithm. And that our algorithm then basically decides whether your car gets to charge. That means basically whether you're allowed to drive, because if your battery is empty, you can't go anywhere. So that's the way it's happening. So the problem about this is that it's really hard to understand. And it might also feel arbitrary, maybe. And we think it's important that users have some idea of what's happening in this algorithm for two reasons. One, if it does something that you do not like, you should be able to allow the right to complain about this. It should not just be something that happens and that you kind of have to agree with, but you should be able to do that. And the second thing is, it's also important because this whole public charging station infrastructure, it is a public thing. And if it's a public thing, we should publicly decide on the rules that are used there. So for instance, there has been talk on giving, for instance, medical personnel a charging priority at some point in the future. And in a way that would make sense, because if they need to rush out to an emergency, then it makes sense that they don't have an empty battery. But the decision on whether we ought to do that or not, that is inherently a decision that should be taken in the appropriate democratic bodies. So that typically would mean a local council or maybe the Dutch parliament, it depends. And if you want to do anything like that, that means that people need to have kind of an opinion on what's happening in this smart charging process in the first place. Because if you don't know that, then you can't formulate an opinion on that. So with this, we try to see how we could actually make this smart charging algorithm understandable to people. And we did that in a project that's called the Transparent Charging Station that we undertook with a lot of different parties. And the first iteration is this device. That was kind of mainly meant as a talking piece. It was rather well received. And the idea was here that various users could kind of plug in their car, and the users are represented by different colors. So on the right-hand side, you see part of the interface, and you should basically think about this like you're playing the game of Tetris. And with most people, then it instantly becomes clear that the red kind of circles will go first. So that means, no, sorry, the blue one, the blue user first gets priority, and after that, the red and the green user get charging permission, because all the lines kind of drop down. And we introduced here kind of a set of cards to create awareness. So these cards would all have different priorities. There would be a card with a normal kind of privilege, but there would also be a card for diplomats, which would get higher priorities, or medical doctors that would get better priorities and would be able to jump the queue actually. But we also had a card for an ex-convict or somebody who was on parole, and they would typically be getting kind of a really low priority. So even if they would be arriving earlier, their charging demands would still be after the citizens. And the whole point of this was not that we think the priorities should be set in such a way, but we think we should think about this as society, how if we want this to go this direction, because if we know nothing, that's the direction we're going. So we're right now piloting an interface to see if we can actually do this in physical space. And we basically learned a couple of lessons, and I want to share these with you. So the first lesson is, simple algorithms are really, really hard to explain. Even the algorithm that was happening in this particular process, that's just some if-or statements, it's already very difficult to come up with, for instance, a metaphor in physical space. For instance, we experimented with kind of a water pipe system. Like if you turn this tap on, open, then the electricity or the water flows that way. You can't do that, even with simple algorithms. And also, it turned out that we did a lot of kind of user sessions. People are really mostly uninterested in this stuff. And I mean, that might be a kind of a job. We were rather surprised by this at first, let's put it like that. But then we thought, well, maybe they have a right to be uninterested about this, because in the end, this is really boring. This is just about your car charging. I mean, you probably have other things on your mind. But the thing then is, and that's a critical thing, what if you are interested? What if you really have a sick kid and you really need to take it to the hospital and then your car hasn't charged, but you expected that it had? And we think we also should design for those things, because the moment there will be more electric cars, there will be more charging, this becomes more and more relevant. So we have the superficial information, but we also need to do, we also need to give people more in-depth kind of information. And I will talk about that in the next part. So that's kind of the first hypothesis. But we also figured, okay, so understandability is great. If people understand what's happening with all this digital stuff in the city, that's already a good step. But still, you're not completely there yet. People also need to be able to contest a system. And contesting means that you should be, say, I don't agree with that, and can you maybe change the decision, something like that. So we try to apply that to charging. So even if you're shown this, then you can't do anything with that. So what we figured out in this project, and what we're actually building, is something that would allow that people understand and that would allow them to contest the decisions. And it's very mundane. I have to warn you of that. So what we figured out is that what we really need is a receipt. And when you think about it, think for yourselves, whoever gets a receipt when they buy their groceries at Albert Heijn? I think nobody says they do. Except when you really think about it, you probably do so when you think your bonus articles, you didn't get your bonus discount, or when you think the cashier has scanned some items double. And in these circumstances, you actually ask for the receipt, you go check the amounts, and if you do not like that, you can go to the customer counter and complain and get your discount, which you were entitled to. And we imagine something very much like this for automatic decisions being taken in the city. So right now we're designing a receipt for automatic charging decisions, basically. So you end your charging session, and then you would be able to get this information, which says, okay, your car has charged this and that amount, and that was because well, the speed went down because there was a doctor. Then you got a bump in speed because there was more capacity on the grid, etc. And if so, and then you would also be able to file a complaint, basically. A second idea of what contestability could mean in the city. So we're working on a sensing system for playgrounds because there's a demand to know how much use there's being made of playgrounds in the city. And on the right-hand side, I try to visualize very basically, suppose we have a sign there, which simply says, okay, this is a sensor that's being owned by the municipality of Amsterdam. The purpose of this is to measure the use of the playground. And the only thing it collects is simply the number of persons per hour. So it doesn't collect very much personal data about you. Then still, I mean, that's okay, I think, but still you can't do very much about that. And what if you really don't like this? Because in the Amsterdam Coalition Agreement, it also says that Amsterdam people should be able to go throughout the city without being registered or spotted by sensing systems. And this thing does, I mean, it does count you in the end. So what if you could have an opt-out for these situations? What if we would simply imagine a button which, if you press it, switches off the sensing equipment for, let's say, 30 minutes. So not completely off, because that would make the whole point of the sensing system go away, because then you, as a municipality, would have no information on whether the playground is being used or not. But if you just lose 30 minutes of data, I mean, okay, sure, you have less data than you would otherwise have, but in the end, how many people do we really expect to be pressing that button? You should be able to design a button in such a way that only the people who are really concerned for this have an opt-out. And that would kind of, I think, be a win-win, because the municipality would still have all the data, or wouldn't have all the data, but it would have way of enough data to actually do something with that. But people who really don't like that, they have a way to be not part of this whole system. So that's kind of the whole idea of contestability. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm going to skip the next part, I suggest, because that's about human dignity, and give the floor to Surbi, who will be presenting on another hypothesis. Is that okay, Surbi?
Yes, so I think we should do that. Thank you, Thijs.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen. So the next idea that we want to present to you is the hypothesis of accessibility. So we believe that sensor systems should allow you to assess their affordances, what they can and cannot do, without you having to rely on labels and third-party guarantees. Now, what we mean by that is since IoT and kind of sensor systems, smart systems are embedded so much in technology, intentionally or unintentionally, things can go really wrong. There can be function creep, there can be data leaks and kind of various things. And since at the moment, only a small group of experts oversee these systems, they make the decisions. And as we just talked, they're not really well understood by citizens, not easy to explain. The ramifications if things go wrong are really huge. So if there's kind of personal data that's being leaked, that can be super problematic. And what if this small group of experts has an oversight and they miss things? So the idea with accessibility is how could you bring this idea of being able to check the systems very visually to the people, you know? So and a very basic example of this is the shutter that we have on our laptop. So it gives you an instinctive, clear guarantee if this specific camera on your laptop is recording or not recording. And stemming from that, I'll explain the idea of accessibility in the urban context with the project that we've been working on for a few months now called Shutter Cameras. So the idea is there's increasing use of cameras in the city to improve urban functions, of course, but it could also potentially lead to the growing surveillance state if these cameras are not club with a system of checks and balances? And then how do you democratize this oversight? So how do you make it apparent and tangible from this kind of closed group of people which make these decisions to really everybody in the city, you know? And we start out in the context of the cameras in the city by focusing on this group of cameras that could be largely switched off without meaningful loss of data, say compared to a public security camera that probably really needs to be on all the time. And an interesting case that kind of helped us develop this project is the case of the cameras on bridges over canals. So you have several canals, and then you have these pedestrian and cyclist bridges over them. And the only purpose of these cameras is to really check if there are people on the bridge when the bridge needs to open and a ship needs to pass. And all other times, these cameras don't really need to be recording data. So we started questioning, could they be then covered with a shutter? And that gives you a very instinctive, visible guarantee in the physical infrastructure of the city that the camera is not recording. So we built a prototype and we plugged it on to a pole in the city. And we asked a bunch of people and had some super interesting kind of insights on, and people found it comfortable. You know, people could see it, and it gives a instinctive guarantee that the camera is not recording. So this is something we're developing further now. We're prototyping it, making it work. The next hypothesis is about sensor minimization. So the idea is that sensor system hardware should be designed to collect as little data as possible. As we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, you could limit things at the software level also, but then software is very easily, you can manipulate software very easily. So we are trying to limit things at the hardware level itself. So to give you some context, increasingly so, there are more and more sensors in the city, and there's a lot of data being collected, probably too much data being collected. And that creates a direct threat to privacy and citizen rights in the public space. I mean, looking at this kind of facial recognition example and other examples that we discussed in the beginning. So we've tried to categorize sensors in these kind of levels of intrusiveness that they come with. So there are these highly intrusive sensors which constantly record and store personal data. What we mean by personal data is data which can be used to recognize individuals, you know, like look at your face, know who you are. And then the less intrusive sensors are the sensors that have on-device processing to anonymize this kind of personal data. And the least intrusive ones that you're trying to focus on here are the sensors which don't collect personal data from the get-go, or like to begin with. So to give you some examples, there are security cameras which look at things as they are. But another category of cameras which is less intrusive and has this kind of anonymization software on its board would look at the same image in this kind of bubbled up version with like heights recognized, trajectories recognized, but it wouldn't really store this footage of like people's faces and who they are. Now we are trying to focus on this third category of sensors, and the most recognizable examples could be an induction loop in the city. So when you bike over it, it senses that you biked or you walked over it, and it kind of gives a signal to the traffic light system, or a light push button. And going by that category, there are kind of three things that we believe sensor minimization can focus on. So it's minimization of intrusive sensors to only where necessary. So kind of creating this proportionality to use and purpose, and replacing intrusive sensors with non-intrusive sensors. So really thinking about what is the purpose of this sensor being installed here? Why do you need a camera here? And can that function be replaced by a less intrusive sensor, which doesn't really collect personal data, but still gets the job done? And we've been developing this sensor now called a millimeter wave sensor. So the idea with this sensor is in the context of the coronavirus crowd monitoring now, cities need in public space to be able to assess how crowded it is in a particular place at a particular time. But you don't really need to know which particular person was there. You just need an estimation of how many people were there in that space. So we're developing this privacy-friendly alternative to camera surveillance in this city. and trying to minimize the personal data being collected instead of anonymizing it later. So the kind of third degree of devices, and we're trying to do this by limitations at the hardware level. So this cannot be manipulated by later software updates. And we expect that this significantly reduces the risk with the data collected, since personal data is not collected from the get-go. So to explain a little bit more about what this device does, is it's like a radar, and it sends out a bunch of signals, and moving objects kind of reflect back on those signals, and people are registered, or moving objects are registered as a collection of dots and not as photographic kind of images. So this is what one of our prototypes actually looks at. We kind of try to visualize the data, and a moving person is just detected as a bunch of dots. And when you compare that to like a video camera footage, you understand it's really not personal data. So the only information gathered is the height and kind of how they walk, the people. And given the logic of a large urban environment with multiple people kind of coming in and going, it becomes effectively impossible to identify persons. And this is how we're trying to kind of operationalize this idea that sensing systems by hardware and by kind of limited capacity and specificity should be designed to collect as little data as possible. And kind of quickly running through the next hypotheses that we have, which is what can these devices help you do. So once the idea is sensing systems should allow citizens to self-regulate their behavior. So once this data becomes accessible, what do people do with this data? How does it help them? Could there be a way? So currently the sensing systems are mostly used as systems to impose fines and oversights by the authorities. But could interaction and information that the sensors give to the citizens help in a certain way? So with the specific millimeter wave sensor, now we're developing kind of user interaction, and we're looking at making the data stream kind of subscriptive. So citizens and government authorities both have access to the data. The sensor itself kind of gives you information, so probably by a number counter, saying there are 32 people in this space at this particular point. And we believe that easily accessible data can help citizens resolve conflicts amongst themselves. So once kind of this data becomes available, you make these conflicts tangible, right? People, say residents and shopkeepers in the old city center, have different ideas. So the shopkeepers want more and more tourists, and the residents don't want so many tourists because they want peace and quiet in their residential environment. And by having this kind of crowdedness data available, they can mediate the use of space. They can have these discussions on agreements without having to kind of go and complain to the municipality and have like a third authority come in and help them resolve these conflicts. And also the other idea is there could be self-regulatory behavior that's encouraged in citizens. So when they see this kind of 32 people, they know it's getting super crowded in this space, and they can act on their own. So also those sensor itself could encourage them, it's getting too crowded, and the police authority don't really need to come in and ask the crowds to kind of break. So this is the idea with sensing systems being affording citizens to self-regulate their behavior and mediate conflicts amongst themselves. Thais, if you would like to add something.
No, not at this stage. I think we're approaching the conclusion, and then we can enter the Q&A. Yeah, so yeah, we've been trying to give you, I'm sorry, I think now you can hear me better. We've been trying to present you some overview of the work we are trying to do here, because we feel this smart city shouldn't be a kind of top-down, efficiency-run, big buildings with glass facades, clean kind of thing. And it should allow for human feelings and human behavior. And particularly, we should design the whole system with a lot of checks and balances. I mean, it's fun that we can use robots to kind of do certain things in the city, but we should be really careful. I think that's kind of one of the ideas we have. And this is kind of still it's imagining and figuring out, I think, in the end, kind of design patterns that will work, that will make kind of what a city brings in terms of sensing equipment feel less wrong to certain parts of the population. Let's put it like that. Yeah, so it is really kind of how we're trying to operationalize some of these values when you really look at the technical stuff that's there. So the actual hardware, the actual algorithms in them, and how they could function in the city. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tyson Serby. I think it's a very interesting presentation. I personally learned a lot. Yeah, I didn't know many things on what's going on in Amsterdam with this, so it's very interesting things. I don't know, maybe, no. So, okay, so we actually didn't get any questions in Q&A box.
We don't have them yet, but
please ask if you want.
Yeah, please ask. That's a request to the audience. Just to start the debate and start with LADAR, and which is the entities in the systems, the say the shutter cameras or the traffic lights. One of the remarks you made when you discussed sensor minimalization is that occasionally you could allow these entities to communicate with each other. If I push the boundary a little bit and I reinterpret the sensor minimalization, I could imagine that if we all recall the image of the cargo bike, which is in the beginning of your presentation introduced, a typically Amsterdam way of moving around, two kids in the cargo. There's traffic light in front of them and the camera is screening them. So now what both entities have a processing on board. They have a Wi-Fi sensor which delivers it to the processing and the dashboard control. If I take out the dashboard control and I distribute it to the entities, then we might have a more efficient scheme, particularly by learning from the Internet of Things. So entities communicate with each other. There's nothing in between. It saves a lot of energy. It saves a lot of processing. Yet what could happen in this image is that the camera decides what to collect for the traffic light, whereas the camera also decides what to collect, for example, for crowd control, which is two different things and different collections of material. So you lay the responsibility to the engineer of the camera. In the other perspective of the traffic light decides what to incorporate of the data sent by the camera and how to interpret it. So what I want to sketch with this, it is indeed helping us to minimalize processing and get the chain closer together. But how, in that sense, are you able to introduce the checks and balances you are putting forward in the last remarks? Because in the classical model of urban governance, there is a government who's taking charge. Now you introduce already the Alphabet City in Toronto, a Google kind of operation, which is discussed because now the governance is in the hands of Google. And by distributing sensors, you give it away to a multiplicity of parties. So how should we deal with this? And how could we then introduce the checks and balances?
Yeah, that's a good question, I think. It's also, so let me be clear. I think these things should be under public control. And they are still in Amsterdam at present, really. We just haven't been talking about kind of the governance arrangements that are kind of implicit in the city. But yeah, it starts there. So how it typically works is that sometimes these objects are simply owned by the municipality, but a lot of times market parties provide them. But then government would write out a tender. And in these tender, these are really long documents with all these kind of conditions, which on the one hand specify the functionality. So this is what the sensor or the device should do and not do. But they also include a paragraph on oversight, basically. So we as a city, on behalf of the public, in this tender, we claim the right to look at this part of an algorithm if we think and see there's something wrong going on with that. So for instance, when you look at scan cars in the city of Amsterdam, so these are these vehicles that drive around and basically are used to fine people for not paying their parking dues. Their behavior and the process that they follow, firstly, there's a human in the loop there. The fines are not being given by the machine. There's just a human operator sitting behind a laptop with a red button and a green button, and he's kind of pressing one or the other when he's being presented by the imagery. But and second, the kind of the person who's doing that, they also are BOA in Dutch, so they have a specific training and clearance and kind of specific status to be able to allow to do that. And thirdly, they have very specific working instructions which have been drawn up by the city. So I think at present, the system, kind of all these smart systems are really still quite under public control of the city. We should just struggle that they will remain in that way.
Yeah.
Does it answer your question, Maurice?
Well, yes, absolutely. So you give the direction where we need to think of public control in these kind of systems in a novel way, as well as maybe even the kind of policing and checking all the elements which are in the system of communication, which affect in the end the use of the public space. It's clear. That's nice. I want slowly, in a few steps, I want to achieve the level of the public space as it is. But for the sake of this presentation, I would like to introduce two value conflicts for you. And also to sort of, how do you say, it try to get the brains active of the audience. First, value conflict. We still have the image of the cargo bike, typically for Amsterdam, which is sensed by the camera and the traffic lights turns green in favor of whoever. But now, the cross point where the bike is a cross point of the cargo bike and a car vehicle. So on the other side of the traffic light, there is the car. Now, imagine this car is oil-based. Then, which light turns green earlier? The one for the car or for the bike? Could we have an answer on that? And if now the car is completely efficient, minimalized in energy consumption and electric, when turns the light green then? And if we then push the limits, imagine there is a traffic jam of electric, very efficient, maybe even self-driving cars, and it is blocking the roads and the cargo bike is prioritized. How do we decide? Is there a kind of scheme how to solve these kind of value conflicts. What would you think? How to overcome these kind of multiplicity of senses and interests?
Maurice, are you then assuming the sensors could sense all this information?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Very good clarification question. I presume that there's also a camera looking at the car mobility. Can we deal with this complexity, Thijs? Or Sorby?
Yeah, so my quick answer would be, I don't have a position on that. Sorry to say. The thing is, I have a position who ought to solve these things. And that should be the authorities that we have democratically appointed to be in charge of traffic rules and regulations. That's the first thing. So I can speculate on what I as a person would think, but the key point we're trying to make here is that we shouldn't do that, really. We shouldn't put in engineers who are designing the camera and the traffic light in the position to, for themselves, decide that because they like cargo bikes so much, the cargo bike with the MOM, which is environmental friendly and should go before the big oil leaking lorry, which is, I don't know, for the sake of argument, transporting cluster munition into the city of Amsterdam. That's not the whole point of this thing is that they shouldn't do that. And the problem is because there's not that much political attention for this yet, that this is to an extent happening. There are engineers right now making technical decisions on, for instance, how smart charging stations work or charging stations work that will affect the public. And when our municipal councils would wake up a little bit more, they would be saying, hey, weren't we the party that ought to be deciding on these things? So it's a different answer than you were looking for, but
no, it is exactly the answer, because this value conflict arrived to the surface when you were, as AMS Institute, experimenting with thoughts like who to prioritize, just as a thought experience. And with this thought experience, you want to unfold the dilemmas. So I completely follow that it's not perhaps up to you to decide, but it is something which came to the surface, who to prioritize when it comes to charging the battery of your vehicle. Is it the diplomat, the medical doctor, the sick kid, or those who share the car? I mean, those kind of conflicts arrive to the surface, and you just want to explain them to the public government.
Yeah. Especially because people are finding out, for instance, the city of Amsterdam, they have this policy goal that they want more shared vehicles in the city. So they basically want to get rid of all the privately owned cars. They want more shared cars. But that costs a lot of money if you try to think about interventions that would achieve that goal. But they found that they had this kind of free button they could kind of turn or twist, which is basically, what if we would give shared electric vehicles charging priority over privately owned vehicles? Mm-hmm. Then suddenly I think, hey, this is interesting. Then we don't spend a euro and we still kind of work towards our policy aim. And then, and that's kind of interesting, because then there would be discussion in the local council on whether that's actually an instrument that you should be using to achieve this particular aim. Because if you go that direction, then you can use all the kind of these smart systems that we will be getting, such as the toilet dispenser at the start of a document. Are we going to involve your citizen score in the future in how much toilet paper you get at some point from the, it's easy to program. It's really easy. And it's also when you're working towards achieving a particular public aim, it seems really desirable. Yesterday, we were talking to the privacy officers at Amsterdam, and there was kind of a project where they wanted to increase the tracing on municipal vehicles. So right now, these vehicles are being traced to make sure that they're not being stolen and things like that. But there were some additional kind of environmental goals or sustainability goals, which would allow, so they needed basically to increase the tracing. And when you are your job is basically to be working at the sustainability department of a city, you think, okay, so this is a tool we can use to further that aim. But the problem is everybody is thinking that, then suddenly we will end up in this kind of surveillance state situation. Because from our individual aims, it makes sense to need and want this data, and also to kind of use the data to steer towards particular behaviors. But the point is, if everybody's doing that, we are constantly being nudged into all different directions. So when you think about navigation software, for instance, I mean, right now, take Google Maps. Most people use Google Maps. Google Maps right now, I think, points you to a particular direction. And then I think it pretty much tries to get you there as fast as possible still. But you could easily imagine a world where I would be having a shop, an ice cream shop, and I would be paying Google to route a certain part of the traffic next to my ice cream shop. So if I get more people there, especially pedestrians, you could tell that from the travel speed, basically, I would profit from that. And then Google would be saying, okay, we get the money from the ice cream shop, we make sure that more pedestrians go this particular street and not that street. But then the municipality would come and they would be saying, okay, we are really against, I don't know, dust pollution, or what's fijnstof in English? Well, air pollution in the city. So can't we ask Google to not route traffic through these streets, which are already heavily polluted, but simply ask them to kind of reroute through an area where we have less pollution? So then there would be all these kind of actors and stakeholders kind of pulling at us in various directions to achieve their ends, which I think, I'm not sure whether I would like that very much.
Yes, it's also, you nicely place the dilemma where it lies. Who will benefit and for who are you working? One of the aims of the project at the AMS Institute, as you explained in I think the first slide, is that you want to, by censoring data which you collect, you want to solve certain problems in public space. So efficiency is among those, because as you explained, if we sense the amount of cars, pedestrians, we could optimize the system by making use of their presence. But then again, the derouting and alternatives, how they come in, also are generated by all the layers you just introduced in your answering. It could be the environmental layer, the economic layer, or the social layer. To leave with the latter, the social layer, another value conflict, the presence of cars and even of cargo bikes, all very efficiently molded or channeled through the street network as if it would be infrastructures, may conflict the livability of the city in terms of the presence of people by foot, not traced and tracked by nature, although of course we have our smartphones and GPS traces us and tracks us and senses all the way, but just by the human presence, the livable cities, the shared streets, the living streets. When you would ask a landscape architect, an architect, a urban designer, or any designer in the public spheres, including designer engineers, civil engineers, etc., etc., the trend is now towards designing for walkability or people by foot and giving people a place. So it's what you see in traditional European cities like Amsterdam. Car mobility in the inner city is reduced, but also in the belt in its proximity. So what you do as a designer, effectively designing the physical space, is you reduce car mobility. Now, how does this stand with all the efficiency measurements and all the tracing and tracking which is possible by means of all the experiments you do? Can you find a balance, or is it just you giving the play field and it is up to others to decide what to do with the material and the findings. How do you stand with it? Is it the efficiency driven? Is it the
I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can give you my personal position on that. So I was trained as a geographer really, and as a political scientist. And then for some reason, I spent the last 10 years amongst people who develop all these sensors and things like that. And I don't particularly like this to be true. If you ask me really personally, I don't really like this. But my point is that this is happening. This is happening. Kind of the kind of how cities behave. That used to be something that kind of urbanists and maybe planologen, was that kind of the planning and geographers. It was kind of their expertise. And then suddenly, since 15 years, there are all these tech people who also kind of want to think about how cities should work and how that works. I think. But kind of to answer your question, one thing is we're also working on kind of pedestrian flows. Actually, there's a lot of projects going on right now, which not just sense and measure cars, but also see where people are going who are walking on foot. Actually, we're developing one of the sensors that we presented for that particular aim to see that. So even though I can have my personal opinion on whether I like cities which are designed for cars more than cities which are designed for pedestrians, or I don't know that. The way I see the work that we do is we are kind of agnostic on that, kind of in this whole responsible sensing lab. But I'm not particularly in favor of kind of, and also when talking about efficiency, kind of using digital technology for efficiency's sake is just something that is happening out there. But trying to kind of push back against that a little bit and say, hey, there are other things important as well. That's, I think, more the part of the struggle that we are in, really. So the efficiency sake, I'm actually, as a person, not particularly interested in kind of pursuing that because it's already being done because there's a lot of money to be earned there. But for the other things, these won't happen naturally, let's put it like that. Nobody is going to earn kind of a lot of money in the short run by thinking about how can we better design these systems when we think about people's feelings for their dignity or autonomy. That would be the thing. So we're not, the efficiency push is kind of a given. And the other things are things that we feel more passionate about pursuing.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Thijs, also for this concluding words. I think it's a really nice conclusion too. When we related back to yesterday, then there we have the conclusion that going back and forth between digital and physical space is the most important to do. And now we see a tool which is bringing this in practice. So I think that's really nice. And then still there are the questions of who is owning and managing this data and who is the one surveying. So yeah, I think it's really nice that also we take this ethical and value considerations into account. So thanks a lot for this nice presentation about the practical side. And also the ethical. Then I would really like to give the floor to Lucas. So Thijs, we really want to thank you. So thanks a lot for this presentation. And Serbi, of course, we want to thank you too. And thanks AMS then for sharing information. So Lucas, I will want to give the floor to you now.
Yeah, I want just to add to all the Thanksgivings that was made by Maud. Now we will have to move to another session of workshop. So for those who applied for workshop, you got the link. So we will meet at that link at 10:40. And the workshop will be guided by Milena Ivkovic, and the founder of Block 74. The workshop is called Public Space as Green Space. So we just have a break of 40 minutes, of 10 minutes. We meet 20 before 11. And for Milana, as I see, she's also here. Yeah, so according to your schedule of workshop, you're supposed to start earlier, I think, in your plan. So no worries, you can extend like 20 minutes
I'm not worried at all. I was just enjoying the previous talk.
That's great. That's great. So yeah, we will have like some extra time in lunch break if we extend it, all fine.
Excellent. Perfect.
So let's meet in 10 minutes and that another link.
Yeah.
See you there. And for others, yeah, just to mention, for others who attend to lectures only, we will meet in this link again at Pechacucha. So we will have four more short lectures, 4 speeches after lunch break. So at 1 p.m. in Central European time for those who are not in Europe. Yeah. So yeah, see you in 10 minutes in another link. Thank you for a session again, Thijs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.